Excellent. Welcome, everyone. My name is Sara Qureshi. I am the program director for the Baltimore Jewish Film Festival. We want to thank you for joining us for our virtual talkback to discuss Flawless. First, many thanks to J-Pride Baltimore, which provided funding support that made this event possible. We also want to thank our online community gathering sponsor, Baltimore Israel Coalition. We are grateful to all of our festival and season sponsors. And in just a moment, if you look at your chat feature, you'll see a complete list of those sponsors. Before I introduce our guest speakers and moderator, I'd like to familiarize everyone with our Zoom space. We appreciate you keeping yourself on mute so as to eliminate any distracting background noise. Our guests will share some insight before we open for questions. And when we invite questions, we ask that you please post yours in the chat feature. We will not be using the raise hand feature in Zoom. While we don't anticipate this, should there be a need to unmute and remute you, we will handle that. Our guest moderator, Rabbi Jessy Dressin, will moderate and ask our guests the questions that you post in the chat. We recommend that you use speaker view so that the speaker will be the largest on your screen. To select speaker view, click the clapboard icon that says speaker view in the upper right corner of the screen. Our guest speakers today are Abby Stein and Jo Ivester. Abby Stein, author of Becoming Eve, My Journey from Ultra-Orthodox Rabbi to Transgender Woman, is an educator, author, speaker, and activist. Jo Ivester, also an author, speaker, and activist, is the parent of a transgender child and author of Once a Girl, Always a Boy, a family memoir of a transgender journey. Our discussion with Jo and Abby will be moderated by guest moderator Rabbi Jessy Dressin. She is the director of Repair the World Baltimore, the chair of the Baltimore Board of Rabbis, and a member of the J-Pride Grants Committee, which bears the name of Neely Tal Snyder, a passionate advocate of the LGBTQ community during her all too brief lifetime. Rabbi Jessy, the floor is yours now.
Hey everyone, it's would have been so fun to see so many of your faces in three-dimensional space, but it is still so nice to see such a spectrum of our community. And my dad's here, so I just want to say hi. My dad's here from California, so that doesn't get to happen necessarily when we're in three-dimensional space, so the little blessings. I'm so honored to serve as the moderator for this panel tonight. One, I want to just say something about the last conversation that I had with my good friend Neely Snyder. We were standing in a parking lot at Beth Israel Congregation. We had just attended a bris, which was an amazing celebration for our community. And we stood outside for probably way too long to get on time to our next meetings, talking about how we were going to really double down on our work to make sure that the Baltimore Jewish community was doing the work that we need to be doing to really celebrate the LGBTQ community members and families and people who are just so proud to have queer members of their life a part of the Jewish community as well. And so it's really just a special honor, and it makes me think of Neely because that was the last conversation that we had, and there are some of the other J-Pride folks here on this gathering tonight, and I know that really, her name and her memory lives on by us being able to gather for this conversation. So we are so lucky to have two phenomenal human beings who care passionately about the Jewish community, who care passionately about the LGBTQ community tonight, and they're here to kind of talk with us and to reflect on the film that you all had a chance hopefully to watch, and to really bring a conversation to Baltimore that I think we're just so lucky to be able to put at the forefront. So it is my pleasure to introduce both Jo Ivester and Abby Stein. I'm gonna ask by way of getting us started for both Abby and Jo to take about 5 minutes to tell us a little bit about yourself and any insights that you have from the film. And then for the course of our time together, I'm gonna then lead off with probably a couple of questions, and I'm gonna invite all of you, should you have questions that you want us to ask of Jo or Abby, to share those in the chat, and I will refer to your questions as well. So Jo, would you like to start?
Sure. Well, let me just introduce myself and how I fit in. So 30 years ago, my husband and I welcomed our son Jeremy into the world as what we thought was our daughter. And we were wrong. As Jeremy grew up and became even as a toddler, he showed that he preferred the toys and games that our society views as masculine. And he wanted to wear his hair short, and he wanted to wear the clothing, the hand-me-down clothing from his big brother instead of from his big sister. And we called him a tomboy because we didn't know any better. That's really what he called himself. And as he got older, because we didn't know what was going on, we didn't have any vocabulary, we had no awareness, we were not able to give him the kind of support that we wanted to give him. And then when he, in his mid-20s, kind of figured things out for himself, and he told us what was going on, we could be supportive immediately because of all kinds of things, and we'll talk about that, how I was fortunate enough to be able to follow our son very quickly, but we weren't able to make up for the lost time. We weren't able to give him back the childhood that we wish we could have given him, or the teen years that we would have liked to have given him. And so because of that, and because of just learning how the trans community is so often discriminated against, and the kids in school are bullied, as you saw in the movie, we just decided we had to become advocates. And so it's become really a family activity. We all speak out. All my kids gave permission, especially Jeremy, when it came time to writing a book and sharing that. And everything that we talk about tonight has been okayed by Jeremy. And that's really important to me, to have you know that I am doing this with him and we're on this journey together. And I'm really, here's the Jewish mother talking, but I am so proud of my son, Jeremy. He has shown such courage and such a willingness to help other people by being public about who he is. And Abby, I have the same sense of just being proud of you, and I am very honored to be on this panel with you tonight.
Thank you. How am I, sorry I needed to, if anyone was watching me, my Wi-Fi sometimes makes trouble, so I had to switch to my phone. How is everything? The sound, the view, are we good?
Yep, you're good.
Great, amazing. Well, thank you, Jo, first I need to say. Every time and we have spoken before in the lead up to this panel, but every time I meet parents like this, some of you might know I have a friend who also just published a book, actually literally the same, book came out the same day as mine, Mimi Lamy, I think I'm probably mispronouncing her last name, who also had a similar experience with her own child. And I always feel like the first thing I want to do is give you a hug. But then after that, give you my mom's phone number and have you talk to her and see what happens. But I know that she probably wouldn't talk to you because she wouldn't talk to outsiders. But that is always the feeling that's there, and I'm really grateful. I think the support that parents of LGBTQ people as a whole, but specifically trans people, are giving doesn't just go for their own children, which I think that should be a given. And I know that as a parent myself, I always tell people when they ask me, oh, so you have a son? I'm like, I think so for now. He seems to be happy with that. But as a parent myself, I know what goes into that. And I also think that parents of trans people specifically are sending a message of strength and acceptance to all of us. So first off, thank you. Personally for me, I grew up in a very standard Jewish family that I assume all of you come from, with 12 siblings. I have 8 sisters and 4 brothers. I have about 35 aunts and uncles, a total of 70 living aunts, and between aunts and uncles, great aunts and great uncles, over 70 of them, and a few hundred cousins. So for those of you who haven't figured that out by now, I grew up in a Hasidic community. I think some of you might know by now, it's kind of, I guess, now it's part of pop culture to be Hasidic, thanks to Unorthodox, which maybe if there's any questions, I will talk about that. I was a bit involved in that. There is a queer character in that movie as well. I'm curious how many people even picked that up. but we're not going to talk about that right now. I want to say, and when I was watching the film, and I only had opportunity to finish it, I watched part of it over the weekend, over like the last few days, and I only had a chance to finish it right now. And there were so many parts that were relatable and other parts that were, yes, dramatized. But the part of the experience in the struggle of trans people doing whatever we could think of to be able to have access to the resources that we need to survive. And trans healthcare is not something, I've heard a lot of people specifically now during the pandemic when any kind of surgeries, but also any kind of trans healthcare was considered by, I don't know who made the rules, but they were all considered elective. And we're not just talking about surgeries. I'm talking like if you wanted to start hormones, you couldn't really get an appointment to go see a doctor in person and so on. And it really made me angry. It didn't impact me directly, but it really made me angry because for us to have access to things that maybe for other people would be considered a privilege or a luxury is a basic need. And it's not just a basic need, it's life-saving. Maybe for someone to start hormones might sound like, okay, you can wait a few more months. I know that feeling of not being able to do that and feeling like we need to get to that, we need to do that right now. So I just want to say for me personally, this is personal. I guess there will be more questions as we move along. And I don't want to take this time to just talk about me. If you want to learn more about me, there's somewhere you should all go and get my book if you want. I just want to say again that before anyone is going to ask, how relatable is the movie? Well, it's very relatable, in parts at least. And I finally want to say that I'm extremely grateful for each and every one of you who have tuned in, because the message that we are sending, that you are sending by simply being here tonight, specifically the people who chose to sign up for this movie individually. I know it might sound like you're just doing it maybe for yourself because it might be fun, but I actually believe that every act we do as a community to raise awareness and to talk about the issues that are facing trans people is an act of activism, an act of acceptance, an act of celebrating our community, and it's literally life-saving. So thank you all so much for being here. Pardon my rant also. I totally had a lot of notes here and I didn't even look at them once. So sorry that I went off script.
You did just fine. Thank you both. So actually, like I said, I'm going to ask a couple questions to get us started. And then as you have questions that come up, if you'd like me to ask them to either Jo or Abby or both, please feel free to put them in the chat. And I will refer to them and try and get as many of them answered as possible. I want to kind of start with where you left off, Abby. I want to ask you both, what kind of wisdom or advice or invitation would you offer to the Jewish community in thinking about what it really means to be welcoming and supportive of our LGBTQ community members? I guess in theory, we all want to be welcoming, right? And I know that having worked in Jewish professional spaces for decades now, like we also all want that to be what we say on our website and in our materials and all that kind of stuff. But I want to ask you both, from your own experience, what kind of is the deep kind of authenticating experience of what it means to be welcoming? And as a Jewish community as a whole, what are the things that you think we should be thinking about if we also want to be welcoming and we want LGBTQ Jews and the people in their lives to see us as a place where they want to be and want to kind of live out their life?
Jo, do you want to start? I have a lot of thoughts, but I want to make like points in my head before I start talking, so I don't talk for 5 minutes again.
Okay, I'll jump in. Partly when I think of my Judaism, part of what is very important to me and always has been is a focus on education. And there are lots of cultures that focus on education, but for me, that's closely tied in with my sense of being Jewish. So I immediately start thinking about our schools and the impact that we can have on the public schools by going and talking with the administrators, seeing what are the policies the schools have in place to support our transgender community of students. And there's been more discussion about supporting our LGBTQ students in general, but some of the issues that the trans students are facing are different and more challenging, and the schools haven't typically done a good job. And it starts right in kindergarten where the teachers say, okay, all the little boys line up here and all the girls line up there. And what does the kid who is searching for their identity do when the teacher says that? And it immediately starts putting pressure on the kids. In some ways, when I first started supporting my son, Jeremy, I was still in this very binary mode. And I was thinking, oh, well, okay, in that kind of situation, if we had known and tried to get support for Jeremy, we would have said, call him Jeremy. He's going to hang out with the little boys when you make a statement like that. And then we started meeting more and more people who said, I'm not male or female. I'm somewhere in between. I am both. And then there was this whole new world that opened up to me, and our schools just don't do a good job supporting them. And so I would look to our Jewish community to get involved with the schools, find out what the policies are, get involved on the parent or grandparenting organizations, and get the policies to change to support our trans students. And in the school districts that do have good policies, and there are quite a few that do, just make sure that they are being put in place. Here in Austin, we've got a great policy, and yet I still hear from parents who say that they've wanted to have their kid go to a different school or start homeschooling their kid, because even though we've got a great policy in place, it's not really in place. It's not necessarily embraced by all of the teachers, faculty, and administration.
Thank you.
Thank you. That is so powerful. Thank you. Jessy, can I share some thoughts?
Please.
Did you want to say something? I didn't want to cut you off. Yeah. I want to say that, and I don't mean to disagree with Jessy what you said before, but I think one of the major things that we need is to stop welcoming and to stop tolerating. And what I mean by that is, I have been saying a lot lately that tolerance is meant for lactose and nuts, not for people. And also think a lot about, when we think about welcoming, I do a lot of interfaith work, and that always feels to me like, we talk about like if a group of Christian students are going to come to our synagogue, how do we welcome them? I know it's not what everyone thinks about when you think about welcoming, but to me, it almost sends a message of, we have a community, and then there are people that we want to welcome in, as if LGBTQ people, as if trans people are not a default part of our community. Again, I know it's not what most people mean when they say welcoming or tolerating, but I think what we need to consciously do is to focus on what does it mean to move beyond that. What does it mean that when a teenager comes out to their parents, the reaction shouldn't be, we still love you, which, don't get me wrong, that's amazing. I wish my parents said that. My parents said, we're never going to talk to you again, and it's 4.5 years later and they stick to it. So obviously, in some ways, that might sound good, but I want the reaction to be, that is so cool, let's go and have a party. Or in a Jewish setting, I don't want our questions to be, how do we make sure that trans teenagers and adults know that they are welcomed in synagogue? I want our questions to be, how do we make sure that people feel both fully part of a community and at the same time celebrate it? How do we create an environment where we don't do gay weddings? We do weddings, and sometimes there's a bride and a groom, sometimes there are two brides, sometimes two grooms, and sometimes there are people who don't fit into the bride-groom binary. And what does that mean for us to create a community, not that is blind to LGBTQ people, but a community where we really understand? One of the things, and it's like one of the notes, maybe Jessy, maybe you would love that, I don't know, but I don't know if you can read my really fast handwriting here, but as I was watching the film and taking notes, one of the terms that kept popping into my head is bochein kloyot v'lev. It's a part from Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. During the high holidays, we say it a lot, but it's one of the terms used to pray to God a lot in Judaism. And it's the one who really sees, really knows what's in our kidneys and heart. Mm. And it's not talking here about physically. And I think a lot of people know like the heart, what we feel in our hearts. But there's another word, kidneys, and it just kept popping into my head because of the movie being about kidneys. But in Judaism, the message about kidneys always tends to be something deeper than just what's in our hearts. What's in our kidneys, as metaphorically, something that is even more hidden, something that is at the root of what is really there. We're being called to create a community where it's not just, I love the way you said it, Rabbi Jessy, like it's not just that we have it on our websites and that we want to have a board that is representative of our community. That is very important, but that's not enough. And that ultimately ends up creating a communities that are problematic. Like what I have, and outside of the Orthodox world, conservative, reform, reconstructionist, renewal, however you want to put it, all of these are movements who have formally released statements, both as movements and as individual synagogues, fully embracing the LGBTQ community. Yet almost every single day I speak with Jewish people from these kind of communities who would still feel like, yes, we're welcomed, yes, we're given aliyot, we're part of the community, but we are welcomed almost like an outsider, which is not how it should be. And there's many ways how we can do that. And I think one of the big ones that I've been working a lot on is on creating celebrations. One of the most powerful things that I think Judaism is teaching us is that the Jewish year cycle, the Jewish life cycle events. It's one of my favorite parts. When a baby is born, and that is quite common in the world as a whole, we learn to celebrate that. But we have all of these customs and rituals dedicated to celebrate becoming an adult, celebrating marriage, thinking about when people pass away. There's all these ideas in Judaism that are telling us that when we take big steps in life or death, it's something that we need to stop, talk about, and celebrate that or remember that. I created one for myself because it didn't exist, which was a mix of a naming celebration / bat mitzvah, and actually did it. The video is online for any of you want to watch it. It was an extremely powerful celebration, and I have shown that video to over 100,000 people in person over the past 4 years. But what we need is create an environment, just as an example, where such a celebration is the norm. We need to create an environment where LGBTQ people are not this additional part, like we welcome interfaith, like we welcome Christians into our communities, which is really beautiful, and I'm a big fan of it, of interfaith relationships. But we need to see LGBTQ people as a part of our community, just like we have family programming and senior programming and children's programming. LGBTQ is just as much an essential part of it. I'm going to shut up now. I have a lot more thoughts, but let's get more questions.
Can I jump in, Sarah, or Jessy, with a quick story?
Go ahead.
And I promise I'll be quick. Triggered by Abby's comment on celebrating. So when Jeremy, in his mid-20s, said, "I am a man," what came to mind for me was, let's have a bar mitzvah. And I asked him about doing that and said, sometimes people do this as adults. This would work. And my husband started gently teasing me, saying, "Jo, you can't, and you don't want to be encouraging Jeremy to do this so that you've got a grand finale for your book. you gotta just write your book and don't worry about having him live his life. That's going to make a good book." So
that's really funny you said that.
I didn't do it, but
I don't think he saw it, but I private chatted my dad in the beginning of this, and I said, am I allowed to share any personal anecdotes? And Joe, what you're saying right now strikes me as humorous, because my dad is a writer, and I always say, you have to see us for who we are, not just the characters you want us to be in your story. It's like an ongoing
Exactly.
thing.
Exactly.
I want to just reflect on one or two things you said, and then I have a question or two that have been asked, and I'm going to sprinkle them through, and we'll see where we get. But you know, in response to what you said, Abby, I was thinking of the Yehuda Amichai poem that says, don't stop beating your swords into plowshares, like don't stop the plowshares, turn them into musical instruments. Someone will have to turn them back into plowshares before turning them into weapons again. And I'm thinking about also, Joe, I know you have done a lot of work in racial justice, and you know, I as the director of Repair the World in Baltimore, we do a lot of work thinking about working in multiracial communities. And one of the things that I've learned from some of my colleagues who are people of color is to say that even when we talk about things like racial equity, so much of the way we enter into that conversation is from an assumption of our whiteness. And I think that that's very similar to what you're both saying, right? So on one hand, I want to say, I'm totally with you, right? Like, I get feedback a lot that people really appreciate my inclusive language. Like when I speak to people, I don't assume that they are necessarily in a heterosexual relationship, and while people have given me that as a compliment, my answer has always been pretty clear, right? Like, I wouldn't be describing my own family if I just asked people, you know, if I assumed, Abby, that if you were married, if I asked you about your husband, that wouldn't apply to members of my own family. So I think that one of the things that maybe feels like the room to move for our community is for those of us for whom this is natural, right? Like there's great Torah to be taught about how the original human being was not a binary gendered being, right? That it's always been there, and also we've learned things over the course of time and constructs that we have to kind of learn. And so I think it's like a yes and, right? Like, yeah, we shouldn't be thinking about it like this, and also if we're really going to make moves as a community, I guess I just want to say there's work to be done. Henry Farkas had said into the chat, and I just want to lift it up because I think it's a really important thing, is like, why would you want to be welcomed as a welcomed outsider? Wouldn't you want to be accepted as just another regular member of the community? And I think that's both and too, right? Like there are some things that are unique. We don't want to lose the unique identity of everyone who makes up our community, but we don't necessarily want to create different standards.
I also think that was a bit of a, it could be that I'm wrong, but I got a bit that it's a bit of a misunderstanding of what I said. I actually said exactly that. I don't want to be welcomed like an outsider. I just meant to say that we shouldn't like ignore it. It's like, you shouldn't be blind to it. It's like people who like, you know, who like don't see race, who are the biggest racists. I mean to say, like, we shouldn't focus on it on just welcoming. We should be brought in, like, we should be part of it like insiders, exactly, but still make sure that people are not blind to us. Just like we're not blind, like when someone gets married, we celebrate that. When people become adults, we celebrate that as something that is standard, something that is part of our community, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. Thank you for sharing that.
I love that you mentioned tech. So I just shared in the chat, I've shared two links actually. One of them is the Bat Mitzvah, and the second one is a link to my Sefaria profile, where I have about 50 source sheets, and a lot of them are looking on these texts, like the Medrash that says that Adam was intersex, which I love, by the way, because whenever like you run into people who are like, God created Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, or all these kind of bullshit, I'm like, actually, according to my tradition. So yeah. So,
it's so good when people are like, oh, this is just like a phase, you'll get over it. You're like, well, we're going back to the very first human here. It's actually in the Torah. Rabbis and educators love that, right? So I'm going to ask another question that we had thought about beforehand, and then we're starting to see questions in the chat, both to everyone and some that are being sent just to me, and I invite you to continue to add them. So Abby and Joe, you both have recently authored books, and if we had all been together in person, everyone would have had a chance to purchase your books, maybe get a signed copy. I still invite you all to purchase them. I'm about halfway through Joe's book, and I read Abby's book in literally 48 hours. It was really incredible. Could you tell us just briefly a little bit about not not necessarily just what's in the book, but if you could tell us a bit about the process of putting your story out there. And Abby, why don't you start, and then Jo will go to you.
Okay. Well, to me, there was several parts to it. First off, I used to write since I was really young. Like the first written things that I still have that I wrote is when I was 5. And for those who don't know, and sorry about the spoiler for the book, but I grew up speaking only Yiddish, and then we learned Hebrew. But I couldn't even write like the cursive Yiddish, like Yiddish with the Hebrew letters. And I was still writing with like the boxy Hebrew letters, which is like always reminds me of like young children. And I even at such a young age just started writing. And in the book, in my book, I also shared something I wrote when I was 9 years old. And the reason for that was I always found it to be therapeutic. And at the beginning, it wasn't even about sharing it. To an extent that when I started putting out kind of like my writings into the world in a blog back in 2012, it was anonymous. No one even knew who I was. Because I just always found it to be so helpful for myself. And only after that, I started realizing that the power that it has for other people. So I would say the 2 biggest reasons that brought me to write the book was first for myself. I'm not pretending to be selfless. I know we're all aiming to reach a selfless point in life, but I'm not pretending to be there. There's also the part where I started realizing that the story could be so helpful to other people. I was the first person who grew up in a Hasidic community to come out as trans. And when I started sharing my writings anonymously about my gender experience in 2015, I started having people reaching out. And I started realizing that what I obviously knew, that there were other people, at a time, like if there are trans people everywhere, but starting to realize the really immense power that it could have, sharing our stories. And I think over the past few years, I have become a really big fan. And in terms of activism, both in the LGBTQ community where I do a lot of work, but I also do a lot of work on racial justice. I work with JFresh a lot, which I assume, Jesse, you probably know a bit about the work. I've done stuff with Prepare the World in New York and in other places. And I think a lot about that as well. And we found that personal stories are one of the most impactful actions that we can take. It's very easy for people to hate an idea. It's a lot harder to hate a person. Not that it doesn't happen. Check the death threats that I get online. It happens. People can hate people. But it is one of the most powerful acts that we can take. So for me, that was another big thing that went into it. And it wasn't easy. For me, the hardest part wasn't the actual writing. I'm good at writing. It was writing the proposal, at which point I had to decide which kind of stories to tell and try to jog my memory. And sometimes I had days where I would cry. Like they are things that I thought I'm never going to remember again, but for me specifically, writing worked the way to actually help me remember stuff that maybe I would be better off not remembering. So there was definitely that as well. But at the end of the day, both for myself and what I see the impact being, it's probably the most impactful thing that we can do.
And I absolutely agree with Abby about the idea that stories is the way to touch people, that can be prejudiced or discriminate or not even view themselves as that way, but it's somehow deep inside or institutional or systemic. But when they hear the individual stories, they open up and it just increases their comfort zone. And I started to really figure out the power of the storytelling, actually 2015, the same year, when my first book came out, called The Outskirts of Hope, and it was about families' time living in a small town in the Mississippi, where we were one of 2 white families and the only Jewish one. And my dad had moved there in a clinic. He was a doctor, and I was the only white kid at my junior high. And that pulled us into the civil rights movement. And based on my mother's journals, I wrote a book about that. And when I started doing the book tour deal and giving, I realized that people were becoming much more comfortable with talking about race and it was powerful, to use Abby's word. So in the same time frame that book came out, Jeremy came out. So we had the two going simultaneously, and I very rapidly figured out, I've already got this platform. I'm already comfortable talking in front of people. I know the power of storytelling, so let's do the same thing with Jeremy's story. And in one conversation, I asked him for his permission, and he agreed right away. It was like, he got it, he understood. And then I asked him if he'd write it with me, and he said, sure, if I don't have to write. So he didn't like writing the way I do, and he had fortunately maintained a video journal, starting with when he first figured out, or was figuring out, I would say, because it was really a process, figuring out that he was trans, and he kept a journal. And so I was able to take all of those recordings, transcribe them, and they became his voice in the book. As I was working on the book, I realized, with the help of my editor, that it was really important to show every family member's perspective. So it wasn't just Jeremy's story, it was really the whole family story. And so it bounces back and forth in voice between Jeremy and me primarily, but then his dad and his siblings, and everybody had to buy in. So I shared the manuscript with everybody in the family for them to look at it and either say, no, Mom, you're way off base, or yes, this is right, but you need to change this up. And the most valuable feedback was when people remembered it differently. So there were times when I was hearing a story from Jeremy who had experienced it, and his feelings had been hurt, or he felt sad, and even to the point of tears, and he came to me, and so I'd seen that, and I wrote that, and siblings were saying, what, I don't even remember that, because it hadn't been important to them, because they hadn't known what was going on. And they didn't realize the conversation was about Jeremy, and they thought it was about philosophy. And so as a result of working on the book together, the siblings all had to talk with each other and go back in time to these conversations and just work on communicating. And some pretty significant walls came down as a result of the family working on the book together. So when I think about the writing process, for me, it was the combination of saying this storytelling is going to be powerful, and yet at the same time, it helped my own family incredibly. So I'm just very grateful for my kids and my husband that they all were willing to be a part of this.
That's great. Jo, I want to actually try and take a little bit of your experience as a parent and think about it in connection to the parent role in the film, because I think Eden's father really had an arc of his own development, and I'm curious, both in thinking about the parental figure in the film itself, and also reflecting on your own experience of as a parent. One question I have is, like, how did you relate to the narrative of kind of like the parent-child component of the film? And also in your own reflections as a parent, is there anything that, looking back, you wish that maybe, not wish, you maybe would have done differently if you knew and understood who Jeremy was at a younger age? How might have you responded to that? And I'm gonna just, to tack it all on, add a question that I got in the chat as part of this, because then I can just kind of give you the box for a few minutes to answer them as you please. This is a question from the audience saying that, Jo, I too am a proud Jewish mom of an LGBT child. I've met challenges pushing our local Jewish community to be more inclusive of LGBT people. Aside from writing a book like you did, what recommendations do you have for facilitating system-wide change? So if you can kind of speak from the personal, and maybe as it evoked some of your own thoughts by watching the film, and then would love to hear you zoom out on the other question.
Well, so many thoughts come to mind. You've got to tell me if I go on too long, and I'll wrap up. With the father, let me start with there, with relating to the character of the father. There were some ways I could and some ways I couldn't. Let me start with where I couldn't, which is that I'm very aware that my family is coming from a place of privilege, that we had the financial wherewithal to support Jeremy. He had savings of his own, so that when he was contemplating surgery, he had to save for a while, and it wasn't like it was easy for him, but it was not preventing him from moving forward. That the saving up the money was taking less time for him than making the decision that he was going to welcome this incredible change into his life. That was a huge deal. And we were privileged, and that is something that I have to acknowledge, because it has us coming at everything from a different position. We were able to support our son in ways that not everybody can, and I'm really appreciative of that. A way I could relate to the father in the movie was he clearly was trying to love his daughter at the same time that he was calling him his son. And I absolutely loved my son and tried really hard right from the beginning to think of him as my son, but the love was there from the beginning. The understanding took some more time. So for me at first, I questioned, was this real? And it took my doing some research, visiting all the web pages that Jeremy told me to visit and researching it, and to recognize that yes, medically, being transgender is a real thing. Having gender dysphoria is a real thing. And the treatment for gender dysphoria is exactly what Jeremy was saying to me. But I didn't want him to have to go through the difficulties of surgery. And so I was torn. My inward self, that I let my husband see, was horrified at the idea of surgery, because I said, why can't you just love your body for who you are and accept yourself? We don't care if you call yourself Jeremy and cut your hair short and wear masculine clothing. Why do you have to change your body? And Jeremy, no matter how many times he tried to explain it to me, I couldn't get that at first. And I'm not sure I ever could. I'm not sure someone who's not trans ever can completely understand. And with him, I tried to be supportive, and I tried not to share my fears. And I think it wasn't until we were working on the book together that he realized how afraid I was for him, and how much I wished that he didn't need to put himself through what he put himself through. And that's something that I can relate to for the father, this being torn. In terms of what the community can do, I talked about the school, but there is so much more. We can make sure that our temple community, or our church communities, for anybody who's listening that's not from a temple community, are accepting, and that it is just part of the assumption that everybody's welcome. And it also is really a personal ask, that just in your own terminology and how you respond to people, you can make a difference. So that, for example, if someone is saying, well, being transgender isn't real, or that's what someone says, but gee, I understand folks not being comfortable having transgender people use the bathroom that they feel is appropriate for them to use. I mean, that's just this whole political argument. I can see Abby rolling her eyes, because it's been a very public, painful discussion. But when that sort of stuff comes up, or if it's offensive in a joke, you can respond by saying, hey, wait a minute, I know some people who are transgender or who have a transgender son, and this is very real, and the transgender community deserves the same respect and dignity that we all want for ourselves. And when you make it personal, when you say, I know someone, people do respond to that. And so that's something that each and every one who is here today, something you can do, and it gets easier and easier. And I'll stop there so that
I appreciate that. I was thinking about, you know, as you know, anytime you start in a new community, you kind of get your sea legs. And for a few years, I would sometimes hear in different places, and I'm sure both you, Jo, and Abby have heard some version of this too, right? Especially in communities where there's such a diverse spectrum, where some people would use the language of saying, well, we you know, this makes us uncomfortable, or sometimes people will use Judaism and Jewish text as a reason to say, well, this is not normative in the Jewish community, which is really like a response to Abby, what you were saying before. It was, I wish this wasn't something that was there. And I remember the first time I was sitting in a conversation and someone said to me that, like, this was just one of those things where, like, in terms of some of my progressive Jewish values, it's not something we need to focus on, right? Like, why can't we just focus on the things that are easier? And I said, well, this is my story, right? Like, and if I can't locate my family and my narrative in the Jewish people, then it's just another example of why we see so many people who can't locate themselves in the Jewish community saying, that's not a place that I want to be. And a lot of times we scratch our heads, right? And we're like, why aren't people showing up? And sometimes it could be, well, they don't know which bathroom they would use, because there's not an option to just like signal that there's a place for you when you come into our space. So I really appreciate that, and thank you for that. Abby, I want to ask you a question or two, if possible.
I want to like talk about the parenting, if you would allow me, and then you can ask the questions. Is that okay?
What if I ask you the questions, you can say your parent thing, and then because we're looking at time, I'm going to ask both of you to think about responding a little bit more concisely, because there are a few other questions.
No, so good thing I make notes. This is all what I wrote down as Jo was speaking. So I will try to be precise.
So I might ask you to pick one, because I also want to ask you one or two questions, and I'm really trying
to go for it. Go for it, and I will, yeah, we'll see what's more important.
Smatter it in. Yeah, I'll ask the questions, you'll make the decision what you're going to answer. I wanted to ask you also a question related to the film, which is, you had mentioned earlier in this that there were some things that were very relatable and some things that were dramatized. And I think that it would be helpful for those of us, or for people for whom maybe the only narrative or story they know of a transgender person is what they see on film. If you could maybe share a little bit about what was relatable and maybe what wasn't. And one question that I want to also ask, that was asked to me to ask of you, is advice that you would give to someone who thinks that he or she may be trans but isn't sure. And so I'm wondering if, as part of your answer, you can also give us a little bit of your own thoughts of what would you say to somebody who thinks that this may be them, but they're not sure yet, and they're looking for some help in figuring out how to navigate their journey.
Great. I'm going to try to put to use what I learned on Yom Kippur growing up in a Hasidic community, where we just say a lot of stuff very fast. Okay. I want to say first about the parents thing, and what I kept thinking, and specifically even more as Jo was speaking, the part where, I remember when I came out, and my dad's reaction to me was first saying that he doesn't get it because women are worth less than men, and then that he doesn't think it's okay with Judaism, and finally he's not going to talk to me. But he did ask around after that. I'm not going to go into all the details of how, but through a whole process, he was trying to figure out if I'm safe. And at the time, I thought it was mostly because he's trying to use, oh, it's not safe, as an excuse. But then as I was watching the father, and I think it's very clear, at least in the movie, that the father's trying their best, but doesn't really know what that means. And I think, Jo, you expressed some of these like thoughts as well, and thinking like, and even when you do know what's best, for being afraid. So I was thinking a lot about that, like, is this what maybe my parents also went through? My dad is also an Ultra-Orthodox Rabbi who works for the Vadat. He is the Modesty Squad, and he is radical and a control freak. So I don't know if that was true, but I do want to say that definitely made me think about that. And also the part where we're maybe hoping that it's a phase. There's this scene in the movie where the dad also asked, why What if this is going to pass to you? And before I move on from the parent thing, someone mentioned PFLAG actually in the comments. And I just want to say PFLAG is amazing. And I'm actually doing an event with them, I believe on June something, about a book called Trans New York that I wrote a foreword for that's coming up. If you follow me online, you will see. So I love PFLAG and I will share the details of that event. Now, in terms of what isn't relatable, I think the specific part is this makes it sound a bit like all trans people do is think about sex and making out with people and like having breasts and makeup, like all the videos that Eden is watching and like so on. There's so much of it that is it makes it sound like that's all the life. And obviously, yes, this is a movie. They're just trying to show one specific part of the life. And also, I don't know of any trans people who are actually going to go do that and sell their kidneys, but I think it's a radical version of something that a lot of trans people would do of even to some extent trying to sell their bodies to get what they need. In terms of advice, did you mean by that advice for parents or advice for LGBT?
I meant advice for an individual who's questioning if he or she may be trans, but isn't sure.
Okay, first and foremost, most people that I know don't question that. Usually, if you start questioning, there's something there. I'm not saying it means you should go have surgery tomorrow. I think it's something worth of consideration. It's something that should on its own be a sign that something. It doesn't have to be you want to transition. It doesn't mean you're trans. It could just mean that society has an effed up amount of gender norms that are totally made up and social constructed. So it could just be smaller parts, but there's definitely something there. I would say the first step always, and I'm a huge fan of that, is to find a therapist. Ideally, if you live in a big city, every major city in the US and in many other places have an LGBTQ center. Reach out to them. They can give you a referral to a therapist, a social worker, someone who can talk to you, who understands it. Not everyone. I think a lot of social workers and therapists can mean well, but don't really know anything about it. So it's important to go to someone who knows. So that is the first part. The second, I think, most important thing, if you want to know and you struggle, is to go to find a support group. Whatever that is online, there are many LGBTQ support groups online. There are in-person support groups. I know for me, for my first few months, it was the thing that kept me going. It was the thing that kept me sane. I wouldn't have made it without these in-person support groups. So getting professional support, getting like in person, because there's only so much that professional support is going to do. There's also other things that we need to do. We need people who are experiencing a similar thing. And I think the final thing that I would say, outside of what you should do in terms of trying to figure out what you are feeling and what that means for you, is also to try at the same time to find something to ground you. Find at least one thing, and it's one of the best pieces of advice that someone gave me before I started the transition. Find something that is not gonna change. For me, that was lighting Friday night candles. It had nothing to do with religion at the time. It started out, yes, obviously I took it from Judaism. I didn't pull it out of my ass, but it was something that I've been doing for 5 years. And during the time when everything changed, I went from talking to my parents every day to not talking to them at all. I went from being fully supported by my parents to being almost homeless because they fully cut me off financially, and so on. Like when everything around me changed, I needed at least one thing, one very tangible thing that stayed the same. Mm-hmm. And that is, I think, the part where our communities could also come in. Because if you are part of a community where you can really be who you are, and I know that was one of the first things that I explored after I left the Hasidic community. For a while, I was disengaged from Judaism altogether. And then as I was exploring communities again, one of the first things I was looking at, that was before I came out, but one of the first things I was looking at, I wanted a community where I can be there presenting male, I can be there being a woman that I was, I can be there in between and fully be part of the community. So creating a community like that is not just the right thing. You never know how helpful that could be for someone who needs something grounding in order to, dare I say, survive such a such tremendous change in life.
Thank you. I have a couple more questions, and then I want to make sure that we give each of you some time to have a final word. So if you still have questions, you're welcome to ask them. I still have a few more in front of me. Not sure I will get to all of them, but I will do my best. And so I guess this question builds off of the question before, in that it's asking kind of, as somebody who wants to support people who are going through a transition, for some advice on the best way to do so. So this question says, a friend's child is transitioning from a female to male, and I would like advice on how to refer to him in the past. Would I refer to him as a her in the past? I was with her when she picked out her bat mitzvah dress. Do I avoid talking about any situation in the past? How do we support people in our lives who transition, and how do we not let the memories and the joys that we shared with them when they were maybe in a different body identity or going by a different pronoun? What's your advice, Jo? I'm going to start with you, and then Abby, I'll let you take all the notes you want, and you can respond.
No, I have. This is a very simple answer.
Right,
I don't.
You go first, and Jo, you're.
Yeah. Sarah, Jo can go.
Well, my answer is pretty simple too, and that is see what the transgender person wants. So there's not a monolithic right answer to that, and it may change over time. So with Jeremy, at first, for example, he said in response to our asking, is it okay, all the pictures that we've got, because our walls were covered with pictures, and in some of them he was wearing a dress. And his first response was, well, no, it doesn't really matter. That is what I looked like as a child, so it's okay for those pictures to be up. And then the next time he came and visited, he said, well, I really don't like pictures that show me wearing a dress. And then the next time he came, it was, well, I really don't like pictures that show me with longer hair. So now if you come to our home and look at our family pictures on the wall, you would never know that Jeremy ever presented as anyone other than he is today. So it changed over time. And in talking about his childhood, when I'm sharing stories, I will say he and him and Jeremy, even if I am describing him wearing a dress. So I see a little boy, even when I'm seeing him in long hair in a photo. And that's how I share stories about him. In my book, it's different, because in my book, I adopted a routine where I wanted the reader to come on the journey. And so up until the point that he says, I'm Jeremy, I'm a man, we use his birth name and female pronouns. And I rewrote the book 3 times before I was okay with that. And it's something where I know not every reader is comfortable. And boy, did I struggle with that, because I wanted to be respectful, but I wanted the reader to feel the journey. And so what I did may 3 years from now be viewed as great, and 3 years from now it may be viewed as terrible. I don't know. I gave it my best shot, and I hope my respect for my son comes through. But my big advice is follow the lead of what the individual wants.
Abby.
Yeah, I want to say first, the pictures, that's interesting because that's very relatable. Not in terms of my parents. They don't ask me, they don't talk to me. And thankfully, my family doesn't love pictures. So we don't have, my parents by religious ideology don't hang up, and we have no pictures of humans at all hanging in our house. Only paintings, only abstract paintings of nature and stuff like that. So that doesn't impact that much. But in terms with the media, for example, because I was thrusted into, I didn't plan that. I wrote a coming out post on Facebook and it went viral overnight. And then I got requests. In the beginning, I literally didn't care, and I gave pictures to anyone that asked. So now if you Google me, you're gonna find some pictures. And then after a few months, I started getting this visceral reaction every time I looked on a picture from before. So I stopped. And until now, like my policy is always, and there's still a lot of media coverage, and I always tell them to, if you want to use something that's online, go for it. I'm not giving you new pictures. But then it slowly evolved to a point where now I don't feel anything about it. I sometimes look on pictures for myself, specifically like wearing a shtreimel and the bekich and the whole like Hasidic get up, and it feels like I'm looking at my brother. It's weird. I don't know if that's healthy or not. If there's any psychologists, feel free to chip in. But personally, it doesn't feel like it's me. I do want to say about pronouns. So yes, obviously the rule should always be ask a person if you can, if you're close enough with them. If it's a family member, if it's a friend. I usually say as a rule, if you want to know which kind of questions to ask, asking pronouns is okay, but asking more invasive questions about which pronouns should I use when I'm going to talk about you in the past, I don't think when you meet someone for the first time, you should ask them that question. If they offer it, great. I will say, to quote literally an organization like Wikipedia, who had to, when they went through, I think it was in the early, like a few years ago, the early 2010s, and finally decided, and now if you check, if for anyone who edits Wikipedia, if you check in the when you go to edit, every trans person has like a note at the beginning from Wikipedia, which is as per Wikipedia manual style, refer to current gender preferred pronouns throughout their lives, which is usually, if you don't know, the rule of thumb usually is use the pronouns that a person uses now throughout their life. That is New York Times policy, that's the policy of Chicago Manual of Style, Wikipedia, and so on. Again, if you know the person individually and they have a different preference, obviously that is what you should follow. But if you don't know, that's usually the rule of thumb. In my book, personally, I worked hard on that, and ultimately, when I talk before I came out and I talk about myself, everything is gender neutral. I don't use any pronouns. I replace, whenever there was boy or girl, I replace it with child and so on. And I only use when I quote people. I didn't change the pronouns when I quote someone. So if someone used male pronouns and I quote them word for word, I left it and made sure that it's in quotation marks. I hope that helps. But yeah, ultimately, I'm a big fan. The rule should be, if you don't know, always go with the pronouns they use now.
I think that's great. I want to just offer two things. One is, I think that it should also still be the person's decision whether or not to share their pronouns. So if you are a community leader in any kind, it's amazing to start to normalize inviting people to share their pronouns if they feel comfortable to do so. But in that place of trying to like disrupt the notion of like binary, we do or we don't, the invitation of choice should, I think, still always be there. And I think, Abby and Jo, things that you both said just become so important. I remember having a conversation a few years ago as some friends of mine were starting to get used to this introduction of folks who will use they, them, theirs pronouns as a singular identity. And I remember being a part of this conversation very clearly, like, and someone saying it's just so difficult to figure out. And I was very close to this person, and with a like loving space, I said, is it as hard for you to figure out how to lead with their preferred choice as it is for them to be labeled as something they're not? And I just say that as an ally and a comrade and a person who does not identify as LGBTQ, but who cares so deeply about this day where it's not going to be like, oh, are we welcoming or not to these specific groups of people, but we're kind of all together in this joyous kind of like paradise of like we've already arrived there. And that just to kind of think about if whatever kind of dissonance or challenge you feel in trying to get there, that kind of compassion and kindness to think about how much harder it would be for that person not to be able to go there. And that's something that I just think about all the time, and I think is one of those things that we can do well. I am going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to ask you both to share a few closing remarks, and then we are going to conclude. And the question to you both is about organizations that you think are really great organizations that if funders, both individually or as groups, someone wrote before about being the incoming chair of the Jewish Women's Giving Foundation and just looking for recommendations when it comes time to write letters of intent and invite people to think about the opportunities to fund. What are some of the organizations that you're really excited about the work that they're doing that you would love to see people lend their support to?
Well, there are so many good organizations. There's the National Center for Transgender Equality. And actually, I think I had an opportunity to come meet with the Baltimore Women's Jewish Philanthropic Circle, which I think is one of the chat notes that you're
That's right.
commenting on. At the time, one of the representatives from that organization joined me that day. I don't know if folks who were there remember that. But that's a wonderful national organization. Human Rights Campaign, HRC, is wonderful. Here in Texas, we have Equality Texas, and we have the Transgender Education Network of Texas. I'm actually involved with both of those. Coalition is for getting student support groups in the classroom. So I would love to continue this conversation offline and be very, very happy to present information about these groups. Freedom for All Americans is another one. Abby, I'm sure that you've got some other ideas, but thank you for asking that question, because all of these organizations are doing tremendous work, and the Anti-Defamation League within the Jewish community and broader, so it's clearly broadened out from its very beginnings. It's just another fantastic one, and the ACLU. So my apology for all the letters and acronyms, but I can talk a lot quicker that way.
Yes, I love it. I love that you covered a lot of the national organizations that I was going to mention. There's one other one, I think they're New York based. I believe the acronym is TLDEF, Learning, Defense, and Education Fund. I believe it stands for, but they specifically help through working with pro bono lawyers to go through the name change process, which could be very easy. If you have the access to a lawyer, you know what to do, it's relatively easy, but if you don't, it could feel overwhelming.
Abby, you muted yourself. Abby, can you see me? Can you hear me? I'm interrupting you. You muted yourself. You did it again. There you go.
I'm muted now.
Yes, you're good.
So I was muted the whole time.
No, you were muted the whole time. You had. Sorry.
Okay, sorry. I spoke for a minute and I was muted.
Yes.
I'm so sorry about that. Sorry. So I said thank you, Jo, for everything that you mentioned, and I was gonna add, and I love that you mentioned mostly general organizations. I would add one other before I get to the Jewish organizations. There's a group called DLTEF, I believe. I think it stands for, if I remember correctly, Transgender Center of Learning, Defense, and Education Fund. One of the major things they do is to help with name change, which could be a really, huh?
We heard that. You were getting into the Jewish organizations.
Oh, how did I get muted in the middle? Oh, because someone called me in. Okay, that's what happened. Okay, sorry, forgive me. Someone called me in. I'm on my phone. Yes, I was getting to the Jewish. I was saying Footsteps, which is hands down to me a life-saving organization. If you have one organization that you ask me that you can choose, they have helped me in so many ways, from scholarships to socially. People leaving the Hasidic community they come from a different culture. It's like you're an immigrant outside of the legal struggles that immigrants have, but we don't know anything about the culture, and it's a huge struggle, education and culturally, and they have specific programs for LGBTQ people. They do amazing work. Other groups are JQY, Jewish Queer Youth, which is a New York based, which also works I mean, they are kind of like Orthodox based. They work with everyone, even if you don't come from Orthodox backgrounds, but they have a strong focus on you that comes from Orthodox backgrounds. There's Keshet, which is the international, mostly national. They have international chapters now, but national LGBTQ support group. Whose director, Edith Klein, is a good friend of mine as well. And they do amazing both in actual events like for teenagers, Shabbatonim, I don't even know how to say that in English, but like bringing together teens and adults in so many ways, but also their online resources are extremely powerful. And I would say another thing, there's a lot of, specifically for fundamentalist communities. So LGBTQ people who come from fundamentalist backgrounds, specifically trans people, have a very special place in my heart because it's like a double transition in so many ways. Groups that I've worked with specifically is a group called Mama Dragons, which outside of having a really cool name, they are a group of parents of LGBTQ kids who come from the LDS, the Mormon Church, and they do amazing work. And a lot of other fundamentalist communities. I know there's a similar for people who come from Jehovah's Witness and other fundamentalist communities. So that is another important group to look into. And again, pardon for getting muted and not realizing.
All good. So we have just really a couple minutes left. Jo, Abby, I'm going to invite you both to just have one final word and ask you to think about it being strong and direct so that we can make sure that we still end on time. But one last thing that you want to share with those who have tuned in tonight by way of your own conclusion.
Do I have time to share a 1-minute reading from my book? Because it would capture
Sure.
what I'm saying. So by way of introduction, this is a moment in the book when Jeremy is still only about 4 or 5 years old and presenting as Emily. This is the first time of the evening I'm sharing his birth name, and is presenting as she, and wanted to get a haircut. His hair was about shoulder length, and we were just looking to get it trimmed a little bit. Emily was sitting in the chair and kept pulling the hair on one side as if trying to make it as long as the other. After watching the stylist try several times to even things out, I finally said, let's just finish up. Then turning to Emily, I added, don't worry, sweetie, I'll fix it when we get home. Emily trusted me. She stopped squirming in her seat, smiled at the hairdresser, and settled in to wait. The moment she was done, she jumped up and ran to the car, saying, Mommy, it's okay, you'll make it look better. I didn't know until an hour later just how prophetic her words had been. The moment we got home, we headed straight for the bathroom. I dragged my desk chair in from my study and placed it facing the mirror. Emily climbed up, eager to see how I was going to change her bedraggled appearance. Have you ever done this before, she asked. Sure, I answered with more confidence than I felt. I used to trim Ben's hair all the time. What are you going to do? How do you know where to cut? Will I look like Ben when you're done? Her questions tumbled out faster than I could answer, so I just went to work. I had to trim the hair really short before I could get it to look right. I don't know whether it was my inexperience with the scissors or the growing grin on Emily's face, but for some reason I kept on cutting. And the more I cut, the more Emily beamed. By the time I was done, she looked exactly like Big Brother Ben had 3 years earlier when he was 5 years old. She had a traditional boy's haircut, parted at the side and clipped neatly around the ears. I didn't have the words to explain why Emily was ecstatic, but for the first time since becoming aware of how she looked, I could tell that she liked what she saw. Despite not understanding completely, I shared her joy. It didn't matter to me that her pleasure in looking like a boy was unusual. All I cared about as a mother was that somehow, in some way, I'd made my child happy.
Beautiful. Thank you. Abby?
I have so much, but I'm going to make it brief. And I don't need to read it from my book, but I mentioned that before. My dad's reaction was, after he realized what I was telling him, but do you think that it is okay with Judaism? And I just want to say that maybe I have daddy issues, but I have over the past 4 years spoken to hundreds of Jewish communities, thousands of people. And every single time I want to call up my dad and be like, hey, you might think it isn't, you might ask questions, but they are hundreds and thousands of people who are not just people who are accepting LGBTQ and trans people, but doing that in the setting, in the context of a Jewish community. I think this is so extremely powerful. One of the things that I picked up in the book that really made me realize the thought that went into it. It could be I'm making that up, but as far as I picked it up that the Ethiopian girl who refuses to be called Ethiopian, but there's twice at least, and maybe more, that she mentions Malkat Sheva, the Queen of Sheba in the movie. I don't know if anyone else picked that up, but she is the one, she mentioned it twice, if not more. And I don't know how many are aware of that, but that is actually something, the Ethiopian Jewish community has a tradition that a lot of them are descendants of Shlomo HaMelech, of King Solomon, and Malkat Sheva, the Queen of Sheba, which is, I was thinking about it, and I'm like, this is a powerful detail that very few people are going to pick up, but for those who do, it's extremely powerful. I'm thinking a lot about how many people are really going to get off of this call, of the Zoom, and take away more than this is a really cool film and maybe a really cool talk. But to me, this is so much more powerful because of these small details, the thought that went into that, the idea that the Baltimore Jewish Film Festival felt the need to do an event that is dedicated to this, that we as a Jewish community think about what it means to not just be Jews and not just be LGBTQ supportive, but be LGBTQ supporting Jews and Jews that support LGBTQ people, because it creates a beautiful community. So thank you all.
Thank you. I'm going to say one last word, and then Sarah's going to say goodnight to us. I want to just echo your gratitude, Abby, as somebody who has been in Baltimore, who cares deeply about this community, and just how grateful I am that the JCC would give a main stage experience to our community. And I know if Neely were still alive, we would have gone out to celebrate that tonight. And so I want to name that too. So many of you know that in a few days we're going to be celebrating the holiday of Shavuot, which is a time for reflection and revelation, the ultimate time for revelation. It's the time we celebrate receiving the Torah. And tonight, as it has gotten dark since we've come on to everyone, come on to this time, we're entering into the 46th day of counting of the Omer. And Abby, you said it is such a deeply Jewish thing, and I just want to share with you that for those of us who believe in the hocus pocus of this whole expansive experience of Judaism, the values of tonight are these ideas of Netzach Sheba Malchut, the idea of this endurance or persistence that is in the divine expanse. And I actually looked at, we would have been counting the Omer if we had done this in person on April 30th like we were supposed to. And that night, it would have been Chesed Sheba Netzach, the kindness that is in persistence and endurance. And I just want to leave us all tonight by thinking about that this journey of making it normal that every person who was created in the image of divine finds their place in the Jewish people and in the world we're living in should just be a normal thing. But it is actually a journey of persistence and endurance that both depends on kindness and is divine in its expansiveness. And so Jo and Abby, thank you so much for coming to Baltimore from your respective boxes and portals. And we really look forward to welcoming you when the time will allow us to gather. And thank you for writing and for advocating and for leading. I'm just gonna say that I think about the end of the film was a story of persistence too, and a story of kindness, because Eden's father was worried that they would have to uproot and leave again if Eden lived her true self, and that's not what happened at all. And so that story and its ending hopefully is not a dramatic makeup, but rather a story that can inspire all of us as we continue on. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you all. Love you all. Chag Sameach to everyone.
I just want to say a few last words of thanks. Thanks once again to JPRI Baltimore for their support that made this conversation possible. Many thanks to Jo and Abby for sharing your personal stories and insight. And I want to draw a last connection. Abby mentioned that it's harder to hate a person than an idea, and it's through art, storytelling, through memoirs like yours, this film and other art form, that the community gets to know people rather than ideas. So final thanks to Rabbi Jessy Dressin for moderating, and for everyone who participated, for being here, for being part of the film festival and this discussion. So good night, everyone. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Yeah.